The sky was the pale silver of a blade before dawn, and frost clung to every pine needle as if the night had not yet surrendered its claim. Caleb Boone moved through the snow with the quiet precision of a man who had learned long ago that the mountains did not forgive noise. His traps hung empty on the pole over his shoulder, the iron biting his fingers through worn glove. He had taken the long ridge home, drawn by nothing but habit, when a flicker of color on his roof stopped him cold. It wasn't the drab brown of a jay's wing or the russet of a squirrel's tail. It was gold, sunlit gold, though the sun was barely over the horizon, tangled and wild against the snow-capped shingles. As he drew closer, the shape took form. A woman bound by the arms to the chimney post, her dress torn at the hem, the wind worrying strands of her hair like dry grass. The rope had chafed deep red grooves into her wrist. Beneath her feet, in the dark scarring of char against wood, someone had burned a message, Apache Lover. The letters were jagged, cruel, as if carved by spite itself. Her head lifted when she sensed him, pale lashes crusted with ice. Her eyes held neither plea nor welcome, only the stunned stillness of someone who had already endured more than rescue might heal. Caleb set his traps in the snowbank, climbed the side ladder with the steadiness of a man who knew one wrong step could send them both tumbling. The rope was stiff with cold. He worked it loose until her weight fell against him. She didn't cry out, only caught her breath sharp enough to sound like pain, and then they were both standing in the snow, her knees bending as if the earth were untrustworthy. He led her inside, where the fire in the stone hearth was little more than an ember's whisper. The cabin smelled of pine sap and old smoke. He set her in the chair nearest the flames and poured water from the kettle into a dented tin cup, stirring tea leaves until the steam rose between them. She held the cup in both hands but didn't drink. The lines around her mouth were tight, her shoulders still squared against some unseen blow. Caleb added a log to the fire, sparks spiraling upward like startled birds. She spoke only once, her voice rasping as if the cold had scoured it. "They'll come back for me." He didn't ask who. He didn't need to. In town, he'd heard her name. Alara Wynne. A schoolteacher once, before the rumors started. He remembered the way Martha Kett had leaned across the mercantile counter weeks ago, whispering that Alara had thrown in her lot with the wrong kind. A fever had laid her low, and an Apache family had taken her in, nursed her to health. That was the seed of it, but the men in Silver Flats had watered it with their own fears until it grew into something venomous. He had turned away from the talk then. Now, with her half-thawed hands cradling a cup by his fire, he saw the cruelty made flesh. Hours passed in a slow rhythm, the fire popping, the wind sighing through the pines. Outside, daylight spread thin and watery over the snow. Caleb mended a broken strap on his snowshoes, the steady pull of thread through leather filling the silence. Alara's eyes followed his movements, not with curiosity, but with the weary calculation of someone measuring a stranger's mercy. When she finally slept, her breathing slow and shallow, Caleb stepped outside. The mountains rose around him, the peaks sharp against the sky. From here, Silver Flats lay hidden, but he could almost hear the hum of its gossip. The heads turning when he walked in, the words clipped off mid-breath. The thought of their eyes on her, their mouths shaping her shame, stirred something tight in his chest. The next morning, she woke to find him at the table, a needle in his thick fingers, stitching a tear in her sleeve. The thread was uneven, the work slow, but each pass bound the fabric stronger. She frowned as if unsure how to take the gesture. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Cold's cruel enough," he said without looking up. "Don't need the wind helping it." Her gaze dropped to the mended seam. "I can't go back there," she murmured. He set the shirt beside her and pushed a plate of cornbread across the table. "Eat before it's gone cold." She took a bite, small and deliberate, and though they didn't speak again, the air between them shifted, still cautious, but no longer edged like a blade. 3 days later, the snow thinned under a brittle sun. Caleb rode down to town for flour, salt, and lamp oil. The streets were narrow ribbons of mud and ice. As he passed the livery, Two men paused mid-conversation to watch him. Martha Kett stood on the inn's porch, arms folded, eyes sharp. He felt their stares cling to his back like burrs. Inside the Mercantile, Sheriff Amos was leaning on the counter. He tipped his hat, voice casual but edged. "Boone, you don't want her trouble becoming yours." Caleb didn't answer. He paid for his supplies, stacking them in the saddlebag with slow care. Outside, Cole Danner spat into the slush as Caleb mounted up. "Guess the mountain's got room for all kinds now," he said, loud enough to carry. Caleb met his eyes for a moment, long enough for the young man to glance away, then turned his horse toward the ridge road. The trail home was longer this way, but it bent through the timber, out of sight from anyone who might watch what he carried. Bread. Oil. A length of fabric the color of sunlit wheat. The climb was steady, the air thinner with each mile. By the time his cabin came into view, the sky had deepened into the soft gray that promised more snow by nightfall. Elara was on the porch, sweeping away drifts with the cabin broom, her hair pulled back in a loose knot. She paused when she saw him, her face unreadable in the dim light. He handed her the fabric without a word. She ran her fingers over it, and something almost like color rose in her cheek. From the tree-lean beyond the cabin, a shadow shifted, a flicker of movement there and gone. Caleb's hand went to the rifle slung at his back. The forest held still, but the silence had a weight to it now, the kind that meant you were not alone. Elara's voice was quiet, almost lost under the wind. "I told you they'd come." The shadows in the timber stretched long and narrow, their edges trembling in the late afternoon wind. Caleb Boone stood on the porch with his rifle across his arm, his eyes tracing the quiet spaces between the pines. Elara lingered near the door, the wheat-colored fabric draped over her arm like a fragile promise. Neither spoke. The air was taut enough that even the fire inside seemed to have lowered its crackle, listening. By morning, the snow had crusted hard enough to bear a man's weight. They went about their chores with an unspoken rhythm, her hauling water from the creek, him splitting logs, but every distant snap of a branch made them pause. When the hoofbeats came, they came steady, unhurried, like men who believed the ground already belonged to them. Caleb stepped into the yard before the riders reached the clearing. 3 of them, Cole Danner in the lead, grinning as though he'd been handed a private joke, 2 others with rifles slung low. "Morning, Boone," Cole called, his tone light but his gaze fixed on the cabin. "We hear you've been keeping company with a certain lady wanted for questioning." Caleb said nothing at first, the silence long enough to make Cole's smile twitch. "Ain't no one here you need to question," Caleb replied finally, his voice slow and calm, like a river under ice. One of the others chuckled. "Guess you've got yourself a mountain wife now, Boone." Caleb's grip on the rifle did not change, but his stance shifted enough to speak the rest for him. After a moment, Cole turned his horse with a scoff, the others following. Their hoofbeats faded, but the insult lingered like smoke in the trees. That night, the wind pressed hard against the cabin walls. Elara sat by the fire, mending a tear in a blanket with neat, swift stitches. Caleb watched her hands, the precision in her work, and said, "They'll be back." She didn't look up. "They always come back." The firelight caught in her hair, gilding it as she set the needle aside. "You should let me go. It'd be easier for you." He shook his head slowly. "Easier's not always better." He told her about Silas, his younger brother who had died in a prison camp because he refused to name the friend who'd helped him escape a skirmish. "Some things," Caleb said, "ain't worth giving away, no matter the cost." Her eyes held on him for a long moment, the reflection of the fire in their depths making them seem almost molten. "Maybe dignity's worth more than safety," she whispered. 2 days later, the snow softened under a thaw, the sound of meltwater threading down from the higher slope. Caleb saddled 2 horses before dawn, his movements quiet but deliberate. Elara stepped onto the porch, the new dress of wheat-colored cloth hanging loose in her hands. "You mean to go to town?" she asked. He nodded once. "Some things don't get fixed by hiding." The ride down was silent except for the creak of leather and the slow crunch of hooves breaking through the crusted snow. The mountains fell away into the wide, open basin where silver flats lay small and brown against the winter plain. The town stirred as they entered, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the bark of a dog, and then the hush that rolled down the main street as people saw who rode in. Martha Kett froze in the doorway of the inn, her apron clutched tight. The general store's porch filled with men leaning on posts, watching. Sheriff Amos stepped off the boardwalk, his expression caught somewhere between annoyance and warning. Caleb dismounted first, his boots hitting the packed dirt with a solid thud. He turned to help Alara down, his hand steady at her elbow. She stood straight, her gaze moving slowly across the faces gathered, reading each one as though committing them to memory. The notice board outside the sheriff's office was a patchwork of flyers and curling papers. Among them, nailed dead center, was a broadside declaring her a traitor, letters thick and black, her name printed bold enough to strike from 10 paces. She walked toward it with unhurried steps. The crowd leaned in, the sound of breath drawing tight. Alara reached up, grasped the edge of the paper, and tore it free. The rip sounded loud in the cold air, a sound that seemed to strip something from the air itself. She held the torn halves in her hands a moment, then let them fall to the dirt. "If kindness makes me guilty," she said, her voice clear enough to carry to the last porch, "then I'll hang guilty." A silence followed, dense as storm clouds. No one moved. Even the sheriff's gaze faltered. Martha Kett's lips pressed thin, as if the words she'd meant to speak had dissolved on her tongue. Caleb stood beside her, saying nothing, his presence alone a shield. The wind picked at the torn papers in the street until they skittered toward the trough in front of the livery. Somewhere, a door closed softly. They mounted again, the saddle leather creaking. The crowd did not follow them with jeers or shouts, only a watchful, wordless quiet, as though some boundary had shifted beneath their boots. The trail home felt different in its emptiness. The basin lay open behind them, the town shrinking until it was only a smear of brown and smoke against the horizon. In the mountains, meltwater trickled under the snow, the scent of thaw lifting from the earth. By the time they reached the cabin, the clouds had broken into a pale, almost tender blue. Alara hung the new dress to air on the porch rail, its fabric snapping in the wind like a flag that meant something more than ownership or defiance. Caleb watched her a moment, the mountains high and still behind her, the wind carrying no voices now, only the sound of the fabric and the creak below. Inside, the fire was warm again, its glow steady on the cabin walls. Caleb poured water into the kettle, the hiss soft and steady. Alara came in from the porch, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. There was color in her face that had not been there before. She paused by the door, looking toward the treeline as if she could see something beyond it. "They'll talk more now," she said quietly. "They will," Caleb replied. "But they'll also remember." Her gaze shifted to him, something unspoken passing between them, recognition, perhaps, or the beginning of trust solid enough to hold weight. Outside, the wind rose for a moment, rattling the shutters. It carried a sound with it, not the gossiping murmur of a crowd, but the faint echo of a single hoofbeat somewhere on the slope. Caleb's eyes lifted toward the window, the set of his shoulders changing just enough to tell her he'd heard it too. She didn't ask if trouble was coming. She only reached for the rifle leaning by the wall and set it within his arm's reach, her hands steady.